The regular season is in the books. Nick Whalen and I are going to break down things that happened in Week 18, take a look at the playoffs, see what worked for fantasy, what didn't, look at coaching changes, all that and more. Coming up next on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to RotoWire. Jeff Erickson, Nick Whalen here. Thanks for joining us at the conclusion of the regular season here. Our chance for thanking you for tuning in all season long. Thanks for joining us here on whether it's on the live stream here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Nick and I have had a fun time recapping every Monday and almost every Monday. It's a couple Mondays where I've missed, but hey, Nick, first of all, Happy New Year. Glad you could do this. Happy Coach Liberation Day too.
It's the best of times and the worst of times right now in Jacksonville. I was debating whether or not, the Jaguars had earned the hat this week. I tend to wear it after a win, after some good Jaguars news. They did secure the number 5 pick by virtue of losing in overtime yesterday, which was a good thing. They parted ways with Doug Pederson. We knew that was going to be the case. Widely expected that GM Trent Baalke would also get the axe. He apparently is not going to. I still think there's a chance that, Jacksonville could be pushed in that direction. There's been significant messaging around the league that, there are a number of coaches that would not even consider the Jaguars, who I think on the surface should be a pretty attractive destination, given the roster, given the ownership, but coaches don't want to work with this guy. And, my dream scenario is that Ben Johnson says, yes, I will be your coach, but I will not work with Trent Baalke. And maybe that's the final push to get him out of here. But just a bizarre decision-making process. I mean, he survived Urban Meyer. He survived Doug Pederson. He survived taking Trayvon Walker over Aiden Hutchinson, disappointment after disappointment. And yet here we are with Trent Baalke as the last man standing in Jacksonville. But the last thing I want to do on this pod is talk about the Jaguars for 20 minutes. I mean, there's just not a whole lot to say there. We'll jump around. We'll talk about some of the games from Week 18. Certainly more meaningless than meaningful games, but a lot of coaching news, some offseason news to look ahead to, some 2025 draft talk. So we won't be doing our strict, game-by-game recap here this week.
Right, that's right. I do have to make a movie reference there that I know won't resonate with you, but I have to make it anyhow.
Good.
Ben Johnson is Jimmy Chitwood from Hoosiers. It's about time for me to start playing ball, but I only will do it if this happens. But that's unfortunately, it's just... Yeah, I'm there. I need an audience of one. All I need is one person.
I'm a Coach Carter guy. I'm not a Hoosiers guy.
Okay, and that's fine. I grew up in Indiana. It's fine. Okay, but hey, while we're talking to coaching changes, let's just talk a little Bengals here first too. Obligatory get my team out of the way conversation too. Bengals played well on Saturday. Diminishing returns as the game went on. T. Higgins got hurt, and obviously the offense changed after that. The offensive line's a shambles. They fired Lou Anarumo, their defensive coordinator. They fired their offensive line coach, their linebacker coach, and their secondary coach. Basically, they're cleaning house on the defensive side of the ball, plus the offensive line coach, Frank Pollock, which needed to happen. But I also feel like it's a bit of a scapegoat situation here too. I understand Anarumo had input on who they drafted, but I also think that they drafted bad players. If you haven't been paying attention to the Bengals, you just thought, oh, it's Burrow got hurt last year. That's why they didn't contend last year. And then this year was the defense. No, defense was bad last year too. Led the NFL in allowing chunk plays last year too. I don't think Anarumo forgot how to coach. But I also think that they're either doing a horrible job of scouting or they're doing a poor job of coaching these players up because yes, the defense played better over the last 5 weeks of the season, but just pop in a tape of the first game against the Steelers, which was just 6 weeks ago, to see how lost that defense was.
Yeah, I think some heads have to roll here in Cincinnati. And if it wasn't going to be Zach Taylor, you have to make, some sort of meaningful firing. And, I think it started to feel in the last couple months that Anarumo might be that guy, letting go of some other defensive staffers. Like you said, the offensive line was an issue all year. It's kind of a stunning turnaround though, because we're not that far removed from Lou Anarumo getting a ton of credit for the Bengals run to the Super Bowl. And, going back a couple of years when Burrow was last fully healthy, being one of those guys who was mentioned for other head coaching jobs, right? I believe he was a finalist for the Cardinals job a couple of years ago, didn't end up getting that. I do think reputationally, he's built up enough goodwill that I would think he would find another job in fairly short order. I don't know how much to pin on him versus the personnel, like you said, the scouting, the drafting, which has just been kind of meh over the last few years. But we're talking about a guy who got a ton of credit for the defensive job they did against the Chiefs in that AFC title game. I thought played a pretty good defensive game, even in the Super Bowl against the LA Rams, and all that goodwill apparently undone over the last couple of seasons. But I mean, the Bengals defense was so bad for much of this season that this isn't shocking to me. Kind of it felt like got it together over the last month, but did they really, or did they just play Cooper Rush, Will Levis, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, Bo Nix, and Russell Wilson over their last 5 games?
I think there's a good, counterpoint to there. I think he made it there. He's kind of like Bobby Slowick in terms of like hot coaching candidates, and now like, oh, better hold on to your job as it is. And he will pick up a job somewhere else. And I think you're right that there is a lot of, they beat up on some bad offenses late in the season there. That's the thing that's so frustrating is you had a career year from Joe Burrow. You had the Triple Crown receiving year from Jamar Chase. You had Trey Hendrickson leading the NFL in sacks. You had T. Higgins with 10 touchdowns. And yet you ended up 9-8. Last place schedule, too, by the way. 9-8, didn't make the playoffs. I mean, this fate was sealed long ago. And yes, you can point to 1 or 2 or 3 plays that they, all of which went against the Bengals. And, you kind of wonder, like, okay, what happened there that, if one of those plays goes the Bengals' way, they make the playoffs. And nobody wants to face them right now. But, Josh Allen would have carved them up. That's what I think it was, as a Bengals fan, I want to believe the narrative that no one wanted to face them. But who are we kidding here? The Bills would have destroyed the Bengals. The Bills weren't worried about the Bengals. Maybe Bills fans are worried about the Bengals making the playoffs. But the Bills, the Chiefs, they're not spending their time worrying about what if the Bengals make the playoffs. No, they weren't spending any time on that.
I thought that was kind of a funny spin on the Chiefs-Broncos game yesterday, which, I mean, the Chiefs, that was an all-time pullback. That was, to say that was their B team, I think would be putting it generously. I mean, Kansas City was about as aggressive as possible in resting. And, one of the things I saw after was they really didn't want the Bengals in the playoffs. And it's like, I guess ideally, you probably feel better about, a potential matchup down the road, with a team like Denver. They're a less threatening opponent, but I'm with you. I highly, highly doubt that the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens and the Buffalo Bills are having team meetings and trying to scheme and like, how can we keep the Cincinnati Bengals out of the playoffs? They're a dangerous offense, no question. But teams like that are they're licking their chops when they play that Bengals defense.
Yeah, I get to face this pass rush. I get to face this. I mean, yes, you just stop Hendrickson. I think the rest of the pass rush did improve incrementally, but again, it's against these bad offenses here. Okay, let's not spend any more time on non-playoff teams. Let's talk a little bit about Lions and Vikings, the Sunday night nightcap. Command performance by the Detroit defense. They get Anzalone back, and I think the broadcast did give some props to that and the job he did on Hawkinson. But it was interesting to see that, the strategy there, just bringing tons of pressure on Darnold and how much that worked.
I've spent most of this year talking about how impressed I am with Sam Darnold, and, every single week he's putting up these 100+ QB ratings and he just looks like a different player. This was rough. I thought this was pretty easily his worst game of the season. And, I think as the night went on, I started doling out more and more credit to the Lions defensive scheme, but early in this game, especially, I mean, Sam Darnold left 8 points on the table, at least, maybe more, depending on how you value, going out on downs versus settling for field goals in the red zone. I mean, Minnesota was 0-5 in the red zone. They were terrible on third down. They were terrible when they went for it on fourth down. And again, a lot of that was scheme. Sam Darnold didn't have a ton of open looks, but overthrew TJ Hawkinson 2 or 3 times in the first half, missed Justin Jefferson wide open for what should have been 2 touchdowns in the end zone. Just looked a little jumpy, right? Like the version of Sam Darnold that we haven't seen very often this season. And they mentioned it on the broadcast that when he's off, he tends to sail throws. And that's exactly what we saw for most of the night. And I think the Detroit pressure really got to Darnold. And there were times where I feel like he was kind of generating his own pressure. It was almost Caleb Williams-like, where he's, bailing out of a clean pocket and just kind of expecting there to be pressure even when there wasn't. And, a lot of throws on the run, trying to make things happen. It was just a brutal night for Sam Darnold. 18 of 41 for 166 yards. By my count, this was, I think, late in the third quarter before I hopped on VSiN. I looked it up. He was 1 of 8 for 2 yards inside the 7-yard line.
Yeah. And you look at that, and this is the Darnold that I think we all wanted to talk about earlier in the season. Like, oh, I can't wait to bet against him in the playoffs sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then I kind of came around. Maybe the Packers game last week, even the, even last, 2 weeks ago at Seattle, I was like, okay, well, I'm coming away a little bit more impressed. But then you kind of memory hole 12-7 against the Jaguars, 23-13 against the Titans, that were just like the Colts game before that. None of those games were good.
Well, and that's the thing with, on balance, Minnesota's been a pretty decent red zone team. They're like just outside of the top 10 in terms of red zone touchdown percentage, but there's been a lot of highs and lows. There's been some games where they'll go 5 of 5 in the red zone. There's been other games where they'll go 0 of 5, like they were last night. And you mentioned that Jacksonville game. I went and looked that one up too. And I'm like, I feel like I remember them struggling in the red zone in that one. They were 0 of 5 and scored 12 points and still won that game because it's the Jaguars. So I still think on balance, Minnesota is a very dangerous team. I think they could absolutely beat the Rams. They are down to 1.5 point favorites. That was up at 2.5 last night. So we are seeing some Rams money come in. You want to be careful not to overreact in a spot like this. It's really disappointing, right? I think if you would have told me going into Sunday night, like what's the most likely, least likely outcome, I thought we were going to see a high scoring game that was decided by 6 points or less. I didn't have a strong read on who was going to win, gave a slight lean to Detroit because they were at home, but we've seen team after team carve up this Detroit defense. And I thought if Minnesota was going to win, it was going to be a 34-31 type of game. The Vikings getting blown out was like the least likely outcome to me. Minnesota putting up 9 points on this Detroit defense, which, having Anzalone back, that's great, but you're still missing a ton of pieces. You're still without Hutchinson. Terry and Arnold went out midway through the game. That felt like it was going to be huge. You're thinking, man, like they're down to just these scout team cornerbacks essentially. And even after Arnold went out, we didn't see any improvement from that passing game.
No, we didn't. And, it's like you could see like the air coming out of the balloon when they missed the field goal after, and they finally decided to kick it. They kicked it from over 50 yards and they miss, and I think it was still 17-9 at that point in time. It would have been 17-12. Yep. That's when the Detroit turned around and scored another touchdown. And then they scored, and then another one after that. Just, it was just kind of like, okay, now the air's out of the balloon. Now we can't come back from 24-9 because the way we're not converting here. Yeah, I think you're right not to overconclude things there. I mean, they did move the ball between the 20s pretty well. Detroit, I mean, their defense was forcing Goff into bad plays too early on. The defense was playing well early on. I just think it just became a little too much. Funny thing is, Darnold didn't have any turnovers in this one,
right?
But he averaged 4 yards per attempt in 41 attempts. I mean, that it was just like you said, sailing throws a lot. We've seen this before. We saw this matchup against the Rams before. It was the Thursday night game. It was where they lost Darrisaw right before halftime for the season. And you saw the second half where the pass rush really got to Darnold. Well, the Rams still are good at rushing the passer. That's one thing they're pretty good at there. They rested everybody yesterday themselves. They're going to be healthy going into this game, except for Blake Corum. Unfortunately, that sucked for him. But I think that it's going to be a really interesting matchup here. I think you're right not to overconclude too much from a previous matchup, and especially in a game where they're playing on short rest and travel issues and all that. But it's something to watch for it there too.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, I think, that the Rams opted to handle Week 18 the way that they did, which was just saying we're taking it out of our hands. We'll play whoever. We know we have a home game, whether it's Minnesota, whether it's Detroit, whether it's Washington, whether it's Tampa Bay, Green Bay. We don't care. We'll play any of those teams, and in some ways that's admirable. On the other hand, I still think I would rather play the Commanders or the Packers were kind of the other real option going into Week 18. We'll talk about Green Bay momentarily. You talk about a team that's going into the playoffs with no momentum, and we just got news that Christian Watson tore his ACL. Obviously, he'll be out for the postseason and perhaps even the start of next year. But I still think Minnesota is the most dangerous team among those. But like you said, I mean, the Rams took the Detroit Lions to overtime in Week 1. They lost Puka Nacua midway through that game. The Rams offensive line and defensive line were completely different units in Week 1 than they were now. They beat the Vikings, so they obviously feel good about these matchups. I think if you're the Rams, you go into almost every game, especially in the NFC, right or wrong, feeling like you have a coaching advantage and you have a quarterback advantage with Stafford and McVay. And, obviously having a healthy Puka Nacua, a healthy Cooper Kupp, it's a completely different team than it was at the beginning of the year. So I thought it was interesting that the Rams handled it the way that they did, knowing that there was seeding on the line, but also almost won that game with their backups, right? I mean, it came down to, a last second stop by Seattle to end up pulling that out.
Yeah. And by the way, if you think odds makers don't know what they're doing, they set this line at 5.5 long ago, like early in the week. And, they knowing that the Rams were going to start their guys. And it came down to a missed 2-point conversion, which side you were on for whether you got the cover or not. I mean, it came down. It's so perfect. I mean, it's just okay, they know what they're doing. They really know what they're doing. It's interesting in this one here too. I mean, Aaron Jones only had 10 carries in this one. They seem very, the one big run they had came from Cam Akers. Thought he was going to score on that play, by the way. And if he had scored, what a difference that might have made, because they couldn't get in the end zone otherwise. But that was their one real chunk play of the game. Jefferson had 131 yarder. They weren't hitting the big plays. And on the Rams side of things, yes, they benched all their stars, but going into that, their offense has been really sputtering. The last couple of weeks, they really haven't done much there. And some of this might have been weather, but some of this is also like Cooper Kupp's really slowed down lately. I don't know if he's 100%, but one of the sneaky stories going into the, end of the season is that Cooper Kupp killed a lot of fantasy playoff teams. He had the 0 on Thursday night, and he followed up with 2 more bad games.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is on Cooper Kupp versus just the Rams becoming a Puka Nacua based offense, right? Like you watch this team, and it's not like Cooper Kupp is dropping all these balls. It's just everything is running through Puka Nacua, and I think in some ways that makes the Rams more predictable on paper. But it's also like you have this sleeping giant essentially in your offense in Cooper Kupp, who we know is capable of basically doing what Puka Nacua has been doing. And, he's seeing 4 to 6 targets per week over the last month. And you do wonder if that's somewhat intentional, if they have a plan for Cooper Kupp to have an expanded role come the postseason. But no, you're right. Ironically, the Rams benched their starters and had their highest scoring game since that crazy Bills game back in week 13, right? I mean, they had won 3 straight games in a row without scoring more than 19 points in any of those 3. Like that, there's almost no stretch in NFL history where a team has done that. So, I think they obviously prioritized rest and freshness over seeding, which is fine. I think for a team that has Super Bowl experience, that has a Super Bowl quarterback and a Super Bowl coach, that's an intentional decision that they made. But Vikings Rams, I think, is going to be probably the game of the weekend in Wild Card Weekend. I think Chargers Texans could be sneaky fun. Maybe won't be as aesthetically pleasing to watch as Vikings Rams, but those two, and then Washington Tampa Bay. That is going to be a really fun game. I've already talked to a few people about it. Some people love Washington, others love Tampa Bay. 50.5 is our total in that one.
Yeah, I'm definitely absolutely looking forward to that one there too. One other note for the Rams, watch the injury reports on Rob Havenstein. I think he is their most important offensive lineman. He's been hurt a lot lately, and I think that it's not a good offensive line. They need him to open up some holes, give Stafford some time. There's if you follow the Rams, there's a with and without him in terms of offensive production. There's something to watch for there a little bit there. So as we move on, we're going to talk a little bit about Bucs and Saints and Falcons, Panthers, and then just lead into Bucs versus Commanders. First, though, quick note from our friends over at DraftKings Pick 6.
We're proud to be brought to you by DraftKings Pick 6. So many NFL offerings each week over at Pick 6. Been enjoying playing on the Pick 6 platform each and every week of the NFL season. Think a certain quarterback will throw for more than 300 yards. How about your favorite receiver scoring a touchdown? Check out Pick 6, the newest way to play fantasy football and win cash right now with DraftKings. Here's how it works. Just pick 2 to 6 players of the same sport and choose if they'll have more or less of a given stat. Yards, catches, touchdowns, etc. Lock in those picks and compete against opponents for a shot at huge cash prizes. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use our code ROTOPICK. That's ROTOPICK. Again, ROTOPICK, ROTOPICK. If you're a new Pick 6 customer, play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits guaranteed. Just use that code, ROTOPICK. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-78-89-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos.
All right. Thanks, Nick, for your last reading of that there, even though you did it one time, but it was very dramatic and I was moved by it. And thanks to DraftKings Pick 6 as well for sponsoring us. I thought we'd bring up Bucs-Saints and Falcons-Panthers in tandem because that's basically the way it was packaged all day in the early slate. Really, there was the only two games that were worth kind of tracking. I guess you could, Commanders and Packers. We can talk about them too a little bit and how they were going. But the games that met, and you could tell by how they deploy their personnel how much that mattered. But Bucs-Saints and Panthers-Falcons, I think it was perfect that both these teams were trailing most of the time. Both the leaders at home, big spreads, expected to win comfortably, and both had to struggle to get through. And the Falcons didn't even win. They lost in overtime to the Panthers. But let's start on the Bucs side. They lost Jordan Whitehead the day before in an auto accident. It sounds pretty significant there. And this was already a bad secondary, and losing him seemed to be like a linchpin sort of moment there.
Yeah, I mean that's something I think to monitor going into the wild card round. Not only Whitehead, but Antoine Winfield's been banged up, Mike Edwards, Jamel Dean, virtually their entire starting secondary, has either been on IR or missed multiple games over the second half. And, Washington's a team that tends to have more success on the ground than through the air. But we could talk about that matchup in a little bit. Obviously Tampa Bay ended up winning this game. It never quite felt to me like Colts Giants last week, where there were a couple moments in that one where you just realize like, oh man, this is happening. Giants are winning this game. The Colts are really going to do this. I never quite got there with Tampa Bay. There was the dropped punt, 12-yard kick. At that point, you're thinking, okay, maybe this is the break that the Saints need. But really, I thought the Buccaneers did everything they could to try to hand this game to New Orleans, and the Saints just weren't good enough, not talented enough, were missing too many pieces to fully take advantage. Like even after what was ruled a 14-yard punt, the Saints immediately went 3 and out with great field position. And that was the opportunity, I think, to potentially make that a 2-score game, really put the pressure on the Buccaneers, heading into the fourth quarter. They were still down entering the fourth, but once Tampa Bay put that first touchdown on the board to make it 20-19, immediately get another stop and then converted a long touchdown drive to make it an 8-point game. Again, never really felt like the Saints were truly threatening, but either way, I think a really good effort from a New Orleans team that had looked completely dead for the better part of the last month. That Raiders game completely got away from them, like never stood a chance in the blowout against Green Bay, which will go down as our only shutout of the year, by the way. But there have just been a couple weeks where this looked like maybe the worst team in the NFL. And I think Tampa Bay came into this game, looking at the number, thinking we're going to cruise. There's no way we're not up 2 or 3 scores at the half. And New Orleans brought the intensity, I think, defensively to a degree that Tampa Bay was not expecting. And, credit to the Buccaneers for finding a way to win, but this took a lot of really difficult plays, high-level throws for Baker Mayfield, difficult contested catches. This is an offense that we've just kind of gotten used to ripping off these big plays. Bucky Irving's running all over everybody. Mike Evans is wide open downfield. Those chunk plays just weren't there for the Buccaneers. Like their longest play of the day, I believe their only pass play that went for over 20 yards was that crazy touchdown to Jalen McMillan in the quarter of the end zone.
Yep. That whole sequence was wild too. Okay, so they get to a 4th and 8 in part because on 3rd and 1 they called this the dumbest designed run for Baker Mayfield to his left. God.
I wrote down that was like the worst play call of the year. What was it?
I was horrible. I mean, I get that he's mobile, he can scramble, but
he's not that mobile.
That was dead on arrival. I mean, it was like
an Anthony Richardson QB power.
Yeah, it was the RPO without the R. There was just no read at all there. I mean, he just ran right into the tackle. It was so bad. And then he throws this perfect dime to McMillan on 4th and 8. I mean, perfect throw. And then of course McMillan does the gesture. The refs do this clown show thing where, I mean, yes, they've been calling that consistently all year. I hate that they call it, but it is the rule.
That looked like a first down signal to me. He did. If you're watching that video,
he did this. He went like this.
Yeah. It was not like the Drake London, machine gun into the crowd by any means. I get it. I know it's like, but what point do we where do we draw the line on what looks enough like a gun versus doesn't? I thought that was kind of a wild call to make at the time. But anyway,
and then of course you had the violent gesture by the play by. Okay, I forget the play-by-play guy's name. Brady's partner, but I should know him by now. It's America's game of the week, but I think he's terrible. But anyways, and then just the hemming and hawing and figuring out, okay, is it 1st and goal or is it 1st and 10? It's one thing to make the call. It's another thing to not know the rule. I mean, me sitting in this chair, maybe shouldn't know that rule. The ref absolutely has to know the rule. The fact that it took 10 minutes to figure it out before they ran another play was absurd. Just absurd sequence there. And then they threw a perfect dime on the touchdown. And after, really, kind of scrambling around, messing around and getting that done right. But they finally connected. McMillan, he's had this big breakout in the end of the season. All the talk about all these great rookie wide receivers, and McMillan kind of got forgotten about because he didn't produce when both Evans and, when we lost both receivers, Godwin and Evans right away. During that stretch, he didn't produce. But when Evans came back, that's when McMillan came alive.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last month, he's, kind of really increased his stock, his place in this offense. And part of it, of course, is out of necessity. But he was the third guy for Washington last year in college, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk were kind of the big two. And then you had Jalen McMillan. And I think you certainly feel better about McMillan than you do Polk right now. And part of it, maybe is the, where Polk ended up landing in a terrible offense in New England. But I mean, he looks like a real piece right now for Tampa Bay, which I think does have to start thinking about succession plans for Mike Evans and or Chris Godwin at some point. And he certainly looks like he could be a part of their future for a long time. But yeah, credit to the Bucs for making the difficult plays. Again, I don't think they ever thought it would be this type of game. And credit to New Orleans certainly for not going out with a whimper and making Tampa Bay earn this. And then of course we had Carolina, Atlanta happening concurrently. And obviously the Falcons needed a win and they needed a Buccaneers loss. So yep. I felt like watching, I had this game on one of the screens and I felt like they weren't acknowledging that Tampa Bay needed to lose. Like they were making this out like the whole season's on the line for Atlanta because this game went into overtime. Like the Tampa Bay game was over and, the Falcons basically knew that their playoff hopes were gone by the time we hit the overtime period. I thought this was the best game of Bryce Young's career. I know I probably said that on this pod like 4 times, but it's all true. Like he's had like all the best games of his career in the last 2 months. I mean, this was just an amazing display by Bryce Young. 25 of 34 for 251. Nothing crazy there, but 3 touchdowns, just sensing things, making tough throws. I thought the Panthers actually made a lot of tough catches, the type of catches that their receivers have not made this season. Big catches, getting hit over the middle on 3rd downs. Atlanta obviously put up plenty of points here as well. That the Panthers in a win managed to set the NFL record for the most points allowed in a single season. They needed 38 and they got exactly 38. So congrats to the Panthers for setting that record and also allowing 200 plus rushing yards for the 6th consecutive game. But this is the kind of chaos that you get in the NFC South. Like I'm not surprised whatsoever that Carolina won this game, because I think there's this belief with Michael Penix stepping in that, Atlanta is just a significantly better team and, they're rid of Kirk Cousins. Like Michael Penix is making his 3rd career start, right? Like I don't care how good of a player you are, how good of a prospect you are. Like that's still a really difficult spot. There's not a ton of players that have succeeded with that little experience. So, my big play in this game was the over 48. I think that hit like midway through the 3rd quarter because we can't trust either of these defenses, right? I think Atlanta had earned back some respect on that end. Partially, much like the Bengals, because they had played a bunch of bad offenses over the last month. That this is still one of the leakiest defenses in football.
Yeah, and that the fact that you allowed Bryce Young to have his career day with your season on the line. I mean, you didn't know until it got to overtime that the Bucs had actually finally won. Because remember, the Bucs had the ball down 8 late and all that. I thought it was hilarious how we're not going to show the score unless the Bucs are losing. They show the score. It's 13-3 Saints at this point in time. And the Falcons were so motivated that they gave up like a 25-yard run to Miles Sanders right after that. No, first down to Felipe Franks after that. I mean, it's just like in a touchdown drive all the way. It was so funny. Like, okay, well, they showed the score. We got everybody hyped up and fart noise. I mean, it was so perfect. And yet everyone's going to be picking Atlanta again next year. Credit to Michael Penix. He played well. That rally at the late, he threw some dimes. Those balls to London late. He really did unlock Drake London.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the big things that stood out over these last few weeks is, Drake London was having a fine season, even with Kirk Cousins, but Penix has opened things up for him, I think, more than anybody. I mean, 18 targets yesterday, caught 10 for 187 and 2 touchdowns, had a couple of near misses. It could have been a 200-yard day for him relatively easily. And yeah, you're right about Penix. I mean, I came away more impressed with Bryce Young in this game, but Penix still looked really good. And I think the confidence with which he's able to make what I think are pretty risky throws. I mean, he's not afraid to shoot something in between two defenders, and for the most part, it's been really accurate. I think that's really what Atlanta is looking for more than anything, because Kirk Cousins was not willing to take those chances. He was playing too conservatively. I do think there was a bit of kind of a misnomer of oh, Michael Penix will be so much more mobile. He's not a running quarterback by any means, but he can at least shuffle around in the pocket. He can get outside of the pocket.
Kirk Cousins, of course,
was not willing to do that, but I think some people thought he was going to come in and they're running more RPOs and whatnot. It's that's not really the case. He's as much of a pocket passer as it gets, but either way, disappointing end of the season for Atlanta. Certainly, you think back to early in the year where they won that game at Philly, and you're thinking, man, maybe they could win 11 or 12 games. This is not how the year went. They certainly didn't ever envision Kirk Cousins getting benched for the final month of the season. But the silver lining here is that you've kind of already shown that Michael Penix looks like he could be the guy going into next year. You've already kind of seasoned him over these final 3 games, so he's not going into next year presumably as the full-time starter without any experience.
Right. Let's transition to Bucs-Commanders. Preview that real quick here. So Bucs currently 3-point favorite, total 50.5 Sunday night game. Commanders, I mean, they did this half in, half out game against Dallas. I don't think we can learn much from that in terms of just, and that I think it was good. They got Austin Eckler they have him back now. That'll be a component added to their offense. I think you were right about the Bucs, though. I think they were totally kind of looking ahead. I feel like they've done this, maybe not looking ahead, but so much as, their guard was down a little bit. This kind of happened in the Dallas game a little bit too. You can't be on your peak every game. I think we're going to see a different Bucs team this week against the Commanders. I kind of like the Bucs side on this a little bit. Mm-hmm. We saw this matchup in week 1. I don't think there's much to learn from that. Jaden Daniels hadn't played a game, obviously, prior to that. But I'm not really fully sold on the Commanders.
Yeah, it's still a rookie quarterback playing in his first playoff game on the road, which, Jaden Daniels has had a fantastic rookie year. He's been about as clutch as any rookie quarterback that I can remember, but it's still going to be a difficult spot by default. Mm-hmm. I think if both teams play their best game, Tampa Bay wins. I think the offensive upside is higher for the Buccaneers. I think the offensive line should be an advantage for Tampa. They've been one of the better units in the NFL. They've been healthy throughout the year, which has been key. But the Commanders do have Jonathan Allen back. He was activated a couple weeks ago off IR. That's a big deal for that run defense.
Sure.
But I think that the Commanders are a team that ultimately want to operate things on the ground, and this Bucs run defense with Vita Vea, I think is going to make that really difficult. So I would lean Tampa as well. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if the Commanders won this game. I think these are 2 relatively even teams. I mean, they're different teams, but they rate very similarly on defense. If you look at the DVOA, the EPA numbers, same thing on offense. We got 2 of the 5 best offenses, 2 of the 5 most efficient offenses, 2 of the 5 best running offenses in the NFL. So there's a reason that we have a high total in this game. I would lean Tampa Bay, but it's not a lock for me by any means. I would much rather take the Eagles minus 4.5 at home against Green Bay than I would Tampa Bay right now.
Yeah. I'd agree. I actually set my line. What did I set my line at? I set it at 5.5. And I could see it getting higher. I mean, obviously we have to make sure that Jalen Hurts is cleared from the concussion protocol. I don't even know if that was actually officially done or not this last week. I should probably double check on that, but
he's not officially out, but he will be.
Yeah, I think so too. But assuming everybody is back, then yeah, I feel pretty good about the Philly side of things here as far as that goes. And the Green Bay side of things, problematic. They lost Watson, as you alluded to, torn ACL. Jordan Love got banged up in this game. They kind of were trying and then not really against the Bears. And, they haven't done much to imbue us with confidence other than beating up on just an undermanned Saints team lately.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you lose what felt like your game of the year in week 17, your last real opportunity to bank a big win. You come out totally flat. You basically lose that game in the first 20 minutes against Minnesota. And I don't care that the Packers, rallied back and made that a 2-point game, much like they did earlier in the season against Minnesota. They've kind of played similar games against Detroit. Like that, there's no moral victory there for me. I mean, like the lesson is that you can't be down 2 or 3 scores to elite teams and expect to consistently come back and give yourself a chance to win. And yeah, you mentioned, they were kind of half in, half out in this game. Like it didn't feel like a devastating loss, but at the same time, like they played enough guys, and especially early on, the way this game started, like the Bears jumped out to a 7-0 lead, which was the first time they've led at any point in any game since week 12. And you just saw a sloppiness from the Packers, bad snap on their first punt. Bears run kind of a trick play and return the second punt for a touchdown. I thought Jordan Love looked really bad early in this game, kind of fading in the pocket, missing throws left and right. You had the Jaden Reed fumble that led directly to a Bears touchdown. So even though it ended up being a meaningless game, it really wasn't until the very end of this game and the Washington-Dallas game, because Washington was trailing and looking like they were going to lose that game, until Marcus Mariota rips off like a 35-yard run on 4th and 1, and then hits Terry McLaurin in the end zone with under 20 seconds left. Like it initially looked like this loss was going to cost Green Bay the 6th seed. And because Washington ended up winning, I think that took a little bit of, took some of the sting out of it. But at the same time, man, it's like you'd like to build some momentum here. I think if you're Green Bay, what you wanted to do is basically what Houston did this week against Tennessee. Another team that needed some confidence internally, and played the starters for a couple series, put up some scores, built a lead, and then were able to hang on for a win with the backups. Like that's what Green Bay wanted to do.
Right.
And I think they played the starters long enough, and the starters looked bad enough that this ends up feeling like a negative heading into the playoffs.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes we tend to overreact to recency. There's that recency bias. You overreact to what's happened right in front of us there. This is a really good team, but they do have the worst matchup. They definitely drew a poor matchup there by having to go into Philly there. They're because I think anything happens against Tampa. I mean, and certainly anything could happen against the Rams too. The way that the way everything was playing out, they didn't know who they could have ended up playing. But this is definitely not the result that they were looking for there. And it's interesting. We have a couple of the NFC playoffs. We have 2 week 1 rematches. We have the Brazil game with the Packers and the Eagles, and we have Washington, Tampa Bay at the same location even too. It's kind of funny how that worked out, but I'm definitely on the Philly side here too. And I understand week 1 of the playoffs, usually you get some weird results because you have sometimes better wildcard teams than division champs, but I don't think that's the case here for sure.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think Green Bay has enough cracks defensively, enough injuries defensively, where I think the Eagles will be able to take advantage. Even if they don't play all that well, I think they'll have a pretty wide margin for error. The key for Green Bay is you just can't be playing from behind. You can't. And, the Eagles, they have been a slow starting team for most of the year. It's gotten better later in the season, but for so long they were never scoring in the first quarter. Like there could be an opportunity, I think, for Green Bay, which almost always takes the ball first in these games. Like if they could go down, start this game, put a touchdown on the board, get up 7-0, that allows them to play how they want. But these last couple of weeks, when things aren't going their way early, they get knocked off their blocks so quickly. And you see this team just kind of panic, whether it's Jordan Love or, LaFleur having his meltdowns on the sideline. Like when things are not going well, I don't trust the Packers to get them turned around. It's like they almost have to win like they beat Dallas last year, right? Where it's like this onslaught early on, and you're just going to keep the freight train rolling throughout the game. But I think Philly should take this fairly easily. And again, no Watson. It's like you have no threat to really take the top off. Romeo Doubs missed this week's game. He should be good, I would think, for the wild card. But these last couple of weeks, I've watched Green Bay, and it's like it just seems like a team that's like devoid of real difference makers on offense outside of Josh Jacobs. Like Jaden Reed just kind of looks like a guy. Romeo Doubs is a nice possession receiver, but you watch the other elite teams and you're like, man, they just have so many guys who jump off the screen. Like Green Bay just doesn't have those players offensively right now.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the starting point is Jordan Love. I don't see that quarterback that we saw in the Dallas and the San Francisco games last year. And I think he made enough mistakes early on that they kind of throttled him a little bit purposefully. And yet against the Eagles, I don't know how successful Jacobs is going to be. I don't know how good the running game is going to be against them, because that run defense is great. Jalen Carter's been a big difference this year. And just as a whole unit, this defense is really strong. And I just think it matches up really well with what Green Bay is trying to do. And I think that's the real problem here. I don't think you're going to see like the Sunday night game against Seattle where they, Jacobs got force fed and he just marched it down the field. I don't think they can do that against Philly. And if they can't do that against Philly, then what are you going to do? What's Jordan Love going to do to kind of take the top off? Can he do that? Last year, beginning of the season, I would have said yes. I would have said this quarterback, just got paid. He's had a couple of those moments, but for the most part, we haven't seen that version of him this year.
No, without Christian Watson, I don't think that's happening against the Eagles. I mean, played a high scoring game in week 1, but I think I view these teams pretty differently now than I did then. I think Philly's the team that you would upgrade more probably since week 1. If you're looking at comparing that line to this one, like Green Bay, I think had about the season that you'd expect in terms of the ups and downs, in terms of where the final record came in. But you got to remember going into week 1, like, there were a ton of questions about Philly. Had this team just totally lost it. They lost 6 of their last 7. They had that embarrassing loss against Tampa Bay in the playoffs. Like, they were a team that it felt like could have gone either direction this season. Like, if they won 8 games and everything kind of imploded and Sirianni was fired, that wouldn't have surprised anybody. If the season ended up going like it did, I don't think that would have been overly surprising. So I upgrade Philly quite a bit compared to week 1, whereas it's kind of a no change for Green Bay, if not a slight downgrade given the injuries.
Yeah, I would say all the way through week 5 this year, I had these questions. I mean, week 4, the Bucs killed them 33-16. That game was not close. Week 2, they lose the Monday night game to the Falcons, where Kirk Cousins actually looked like a real quarterback for a second there.
Yep.
Even like week 5, they beat the Browns 20-16, but they were getting booed. I mean, it was ugly. I mean, the defense played all right. Remember the Browns scored on a block. They scored on a blocked field goal, I think it was. Oh, yeah. But then it was the Giants. That was the Saquon revenge game, part 1. They had the Bengals, where the defense really rose up in the second half. They beat the Jaguars, where they had a comfortable lead, and the Jaguars came back, but it wasn't as close as the score indicated. Destroyed the Cowboys, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, this is a good team again. And we weren't asking those questions anymore. Kind of slept, every once in a while, like they sleepwalked through the Panthers game, but whatever. They had these big other games in the interim there. They're a team that I feel pretty good about now. And it's funny how that dime has turned on them.
Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say on this, and we can move on, is that if you're looking for a Packers angle, Jalen Hurts rust factor, I think that would be the thing, right? Not necessarily, like lingering concussion symptoms. Like I expect him to be fully cleared. He's had enough time, but we're talking about multiple weeks off heading into the playoffs. And, I think someone with the experience of Jalen Hurts and the way they use him, I don't think it'll be a big deal, but if you're trying to find a reason to talk yourself into Green Bay, I think that would be it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So yeah, I think that is the key. Is like if Hurts is awful, he throws a couple of picks, all of a sudden they're in negative field position. Green Bay gets a lead. That's the game script that would befit them the most. We'll hit up a couple more playoff previews. I also want to talk about the coaching cycle. Though first, we're going to hit up a quick note from our friends over at LIV. A new season of LIV Golf Fantasy is coming in 2025. New prizes, new ways to win, and more are coming in the new season. Get ready to play and sign up now at fantasy.livegolf.com. We are also on the BlueWire network. Here are their ads real quick. All right. Thank you, everybody, for those of you on the podcast version. Thank you if you're streaming live with us here as well. Okay. Couple other games we want to bring up here. First of all, we don't need to talk much about the Denver KC game or the Buffalo New England game, but it did lead to the firing of Jerod and Mayo. Let's talk about the coach's decision so far. The Pats decided not to hold the Mayo; they let him go.
I feel like the whole podcast you're just setting yourself up for that specific line. Robert Kraft has since come out and kind of owned this decision and said, we'll admit we put him in a bad spot. And I think that was, if you saw any pushback yesterday on social media, that's really what it was centered on, was like, what did you expect, right? You gave this guy who's never been a head coach, a terrible roster, a rookie quarterback who ended up being good, but a rookie quarterback nonetheless. And, what did you think you were going to win 9-10 games? It's like, what coach would have succeeded in this spot? So I think New England was, if they wanted to move on from Jerod Mayo, they kind of had to be willing to eat crow and know that there would be some pushback. Look, I'm okay with this. The New England fans that I know have been on this since like week 2, that this guy's just not a good coach. You don't trust his in-game management. They don't love the way that he runs the team. So I think letting that play out for another year or two, just for optics reasons, don't do it. Pull the plug. If you know he's not the guy, if you feel strongly about that, I think you're better to take the short-term PR hit and just make sure you get the right guy in there. I think this maybe set the record, Jeff, for the fastest post-game coach firing ever. Like this game hit 0, and like a minute and a half later, we had the Rappaport tweet that he was out. I don't think winning this game changed the decision. I think he was going to be gone no matter what. Yeah. But I do wonder if that was like the last straw, and Kraft is like, you know what? Do it now. We're not waiting until tomorrow morning. We're not waiting until later tonight. We did not want to win this game. He won this game. Get him out of there. So the Patriots now have the number 4 overall pick. They, of course, went in to week 18 in the driver's seat for the number 1 pick. Tennessee, Cleveland, the Giants, the Patriots, and the Jags. Those are our top 5 teams.
Yep. By the way, did you see the Gronk, the clip where Gronk was starting to go off on the firing, and his studio mates kind of said, hey, kind of saved him from saying something at something like Howie Long taps Michael Strahan and goes, hey, we got to go to break and all that, all that. And
I would like to hear him out.
Gronk played with Mayo, so keep that in mind too. They're probably pretty close. And he was obviously angry that after 1 week, after one season, Mayo got fired. But I agree with your point, though. And I also think this might be Vrabel related too. I think they saw the Jets were interviewing Mike Vrabel. If Kraft really wants Vrabel, well, you better act quickly to go make sure you go get him if that's the play, or if they have some other candidate in mind. But there was other talk about how Mayo handled the media, how sort of the in-game coaching things went. The whole "are we benching Ramondre Stevenson or are we not" thing was weird. There's a lot of little tiny nuggets there.
I think Jerod Mayo is a solid, we talk about bridge quarterbacks, like a bridge coach. I think he's the, if you're going into a season probably knowing that you're going to be bad, maybe he was the guy to kind of take the fall. I hate that he was set up for failure essentially, but I think the fact that they have their quarterback in Drake May is probably what really forced this decision, right? Like if internally they feel like Jerod Mayo is not the guy, he's not going to be a big time NFL head coach. I think if Drake May had a Bryce Young type of rookie year, maybe you run it back with Jerod Mayo because you're looking at next season as probably another rebuilding year. You're just trying to add talent. But I think the fact that they have their quarterback locked in, now you feel like, okay, we need to pair him with the right coach. We want to hit the gas on this rebuild a little bit faster, and we don't think Jerod Mayo is the guy for it. So again, I understand the angle. We could talk about the Gronk thing, but like you said, he played with him. He's going to be biased. If you have a chance to bring in someone like Mike Vrabel, I think that makes a ton of sense. He's a more accomplished coach. He's a guy who's been to AFC title games before. I think it's pretty inarguable that he's a better option. So put the PR stuff aside, and I think if that's the direction that the Patriots go in, I would support that.
Yeah. I was the follow-up question is, what type of coach do you need to bring in for a guy when you have a guy like May to begin with there? Do you need an offensive-minded coach, or do you need a leader of men? Do you need what sort of style of coach do you need?
It totally depends, because I think we've seen the leader of men type succeed. We've seen them fail. We've seen the offensive guys succeed and fail depending on personnel. I think if Drake May is as good as the Patriots think he is, then maybe it doesn't matter, right? Because the quarterback almost transcends that in some ways. But I think, Vrabel has been the do more with less type of coach, which I think still fits this New England roster. It's not a great roster by any means. Like, you have a quarterback that you like, you have a really good, young cornerback at Christian Gonzalez, but that's it. Like, how many other firm keepers are on this roster? Like, guys who you would say he has to be on the roster 2 or 3 years from now. I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 other players.
Right. I think that's a great point, especially look, at the offensive line, protecting Drake May, the targets he's throwing to. Kayshon Boutte looks like he could be a player, but probably he's not someone that you would put in that upper tier wide receiver either. Result against Buffalo yesterday notwithstanding, but he had 2 good games against Buffalo, by the way. Though that's about it. That's the list there this year. But I think it starts with, who do you get to protect May, and who do you have to build around? How do you build around him? And I think that's the critical question there as far as that goes. The Giants are not going to fire Dable. It looks like they're not going to fire their GM, but I'm really tired. Now they're on double secret probation, basically, is what Wellington Moreau is suggesting there. What do you think about that?
Man, I tend to value stability, as a fan of a bad team. Now, if that stability means continuing to retain the worst GM in football, maybe that's a bad thing. But I think what you want to be careful to not be that team that's cycling through coaches and GMs every 2 to 3 years. I think at the pro level, that's a little less damaging than at least it used to be in college, where you would have like a max exodus of players and recruits, and all of a sudden you're setting your program back 3 or 4 years. In the NFL, you don't have those same concerns. Guys are under contract, so you're not worried about roster turnover. But I think the Giants at least are looking at this somewhat objectively and saying, okay, what product did we give Brian Dable to work with here? Not a very good one. This is another team that you look at and say, how many keepers are on this roster? I was actually debating this with some friends in the group chat yesterday. It's like, what's the worst roster right now in the NFL? Like, if you had to take over as a GM, like, what's the roster that you would want the least? I think the Giants are in that conversation. I think Carolina is in that conversation. Maybe Tennessee and the Raiders. Like those were the four that we settled on. Like the argument I think for the Giants or the Raiders over Carolina is that they at least have one blue chip piece. It's like you have Malik Neighbors, who looks like an all pro level receiver. The Raiders have Brock Bowers. Carolina, I don't know if you have that player. Maybe it's J.C. Horn. Maybe it's Chuba Hubbard. I don't know. But the Giants are in the discussion for the worst roster in the NFL. And I think this is them signaling, at least publicly, to Brian Daboll, hey, we're not putting this on you. You've led us to the playoffs 2 years ago with the quarterback who we benched midseason and decided that he's just not good enough to play for our franchise. And we made you play out the string with Drew Lock. So I think this is fair to Brian Daboll, because I don't view this as some sort of massive disappointing season for the Giants. Like who thought this was going to be a good team?
Yeah. At the same time, though, I mean, Shane staying is the part that I don't get.
That one's bad. That one's rough.
I don't get it. Who built this roster? It's not like, I get it. It was never his quarterback, but Daboll's been around for a while too. I mean, I don't know. Does he have a say in the draft? Does he, or is this all Shane? I mean, who gets the blame here? I don't know. It's very kind of a little surprising to me. Couple other things I wanted, but I'd say I'd like Carolina's roster because they have an offensive line. At least they have a really good offensive line. And they spent their money on that. And I feel like they've got a building block at least. Whereas these other teams, I don't know. I'd say at least like the Pats, by the way. I think the Pats have the worst roster. I mean, they have Gonzalez and they have
the quarterback, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's the most important position. I mean, maybe Carolina has a quarterback too, though, and young. I mean, I think that's one of the things we learned.
That is a good point, by the way. It's like if you would have asked me week 3, like how many more games does Bryce Young start in the Panthers uniform, I would have set the over under at like 3.5 with the expectation that those all would have come this year and he would have looked terrible and they would probably move on and trade him for like a 6th round pick this summer. I mean, we're back to Bryce Young being the starter next year, right? Like, is there any question?
Yeah. Oh yeah. 100% he's the starter.
Yeah. I don't think that's even a debate. I mean, they're picking 8th. It's not like they'll even really have a chance at replacing him, even if they wanted to. So yeah, I mean, that's, if you want to spin that fantasy wise,
even like a debate. I don't even think it's like a topic. I mean, I think it's, of course you're starting him.
I agree. And he's still had a couple stinkers over the last month, but I think the good has dramatically outweighed the bad. And of course you have to factor in the level of investment here, right? It's like if you're Carolina, you don't want to have to move on from Bryce Young. I mean, that's one, it's a terrible look for your front office. It's a terrible look for your GM. Really everybody involved with that pick. And, you're not going to get, it's not like you could just trade him for another 1st round pick. Like you'd just be taking a massive loss, in terms of capital on that. So I think you give Bryce Young every single chance to succeed. And the fact that he's had this second half with, again, underwhelming personnel. It's like, who's he throwing to? A 34-year-old Adam Thielen who looked great down the stretch. Jalen Coker, Jatavian Sanders. Like, I think it's now pretty easy to dream on, man, if we got this guy a Brian Thomas type, what could this offense look like?
Yeah, I'd agree. One other team I want to mention, the Jets. There's 2 headlines on the ESPN football page right now. One is Rex Ryan, if I'm the Jets head coach, I'll end Rogers Country Club. Yeah. And the other one is Woody Johnson, my teenage son has no role. I mean, the fact that you have to talk about whether or not Brick has a role on the team. I mean, is this a DOA franchise or what?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I took a screenshot of the second one and sent that around earlier today. Just like, this just looks like an Onion headline. Woody Johnson, my teenage son has, quote, no role with Jets. Like, just coming out to clarify that my 17-year-old son is not running the team. Weird end of the season for the Jets. Like, I was watching this game in the late window, I had some pick'em interests on this one, and it was almost like a celebration, retrospective, like feel good. Like if you're listening to the call, you would have thought that the Jets like clinched a playoff berth or something. I mean,
I had all these wonderful memories with Rogers and his tenure there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was odd, given how the season has gone. I mean, Rodgers played really well yesterday. Like the one interception was, it was somewhat of a drop, somewhat of a tip ball, looking for Devontae Adams early in the game. But other than that, Rodgers was super sharp, was making plays with his legs. And, I thought the Jets actually ran the ball fairly well. They were hitting explosive plays, which they almost never do unless Devontae Adams is involved. But you're also going up against, a extremely limited Miami Dolphins offense. And we kind of knew after Tyler Huntley played the game of his life last week that was going to be really tough to replicate. Rodgers after the game, essentially made it very clear that he'd be open to returning. He realizes that the Jets could move on. He'd be open to playing elsewhere. They were, again, if you were watching this game, there was a lot of, that might be the last pass we ever see Aaron Rodgers throw. That might be his last touchdown. It could be. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think he's going to find a landing spot. I think there's going to be a QB needy team that doesn't find their answer in the draft, that doesn't love the other options in free agency. I think he'll be playing elsewhere. Is it going to be a better situation than he was in this year? Probably not. Is it going to go a whole lot better than it went this year with the Jets? Probably not. But some team will come calling. Maybe it's Las Vegas. I don't know.
Absolutely. Chris, my friend Chris Harris was tweeting about this, that there are so many teams that need a quarterback and the supply is so thin. Not only is Rodgers going to land somewhere, teams are going to come. He suggested teams will be competing for his rights, probably, whether it's Rodgers or Kirk Cousins for that matter, too. Someone will be going after. The Colts are just like, oh, this is like so Colts. Let's get this old quarterback. And it's one of those two. It's got to be one of those two, right?
Yeah, I would take Rodgers over Cousins. I think based on what we've seen this year. I know Rodgers is older. I know they're both coming back from the same injury. I think Rodgers has looked better on balance than Cousins. Colts will be in the mix. I think there are kind of some, like San Francisco to me would be the dark horse. Like if they were to say we're not giving Brock Purdy the contract, like that would be kind of the ultimate last stand spot. It would certainly be poetic. Everybody knows, Rodgers grew up a Niners fan. He's from California. Like in terms of a situation that you could go to, like if your other option is this crap Colts team or the Raiders or staying with the Jets or the Saints, like the Niners are by far the best spot that he could go to from a football perspective. I don't know if it plays out that way. I think it's more likely that they bring back Brock Purdy and try to salvage this, one last run with most of this core. But that would be kind of the dark horse team outside of the obvious terrible teams with no quarterback that I would keep an eye on.
Yeah. It's going to be fun watching this quarterback carousel. If you are on a team that already has a quarterback, you can just watch from afar. If you're living through it, man, it's going to just really suck. It's really going to be bad.
Well, I do wonder too. It's like, could Matthew Stafford retire after this season, depending on how the playoffs go? Maybe that could be a spot. I don't know.
Jimmy G. Don't forget about Jimmy G.
Yeah. Other than one horrendous pick, he actually looked pretty good yesterday.
I gotta say, one of the themes of the season has been like these quarterback, reformation stories, Baker and Darnold and all that. Well, who's to say it won't be someone like that too? It could be, very well could be. Let's talk about a couple of the other playoff games before we head out of here. Let's start off with the annual Houston spot, the first game of the playoffs, Chargers Houston. To nobody's surprise, Houston is opening up the playoffs, hosting a game. But they did, like you said, they did what they wanted to accomplish. They did at least look decent against a terrible Titans team. But I'm low key kind of intrigued about this game because the Chargers, they're not fully formed yet. Remember, they were emerging from salary cap hell. They don't have their best Harbaugh roster yet. But look what they've done so far. Herbert's just so good. Just so good. He hasn't thrown an interception on the road since I think the first game of the season, first 2 weeks of the season, something like that. It's crazy. I should be able to cite the proper stat, but I talked about that during the game against the Raiders. He's just so good.
He is awesome, man. I've been the biggest Justin Herbert supporter, and I still didn't think this Chargers team would be as good as they have been right away. I thought there's going to be kind of a 1 year waiting period where they would look improved, but they would maybe win 7 or 8 games and fall short of the playoffs because this is just not a very good roster, especially offensively. But they had a great draft, which certainly helps, right? You get your tackle of the future in Joe Alt. You have a huge hit on left donkey. They've made it work for the most part with a really underwhelming receiving core, where I'm still waiting for the Josh Palmer breakout season. Maybe 2025 will be that year. And like Quentin Johnston,
I guess balling out yesterday, by the way. Did you watch some of the catches Johnson made?
Yeah. He's almost in Christian Watson territory now, where it's like he makes the tough catches but can't make the easy catches. It seems like all of it. He never drops tough catches. It's always the easy ones. But other than that, it's DJ Chark, it's Darius Davis, who's really come on over these last couple of weeks. It's like, J.K. Dobbins had a great start to the season. I think he's kind of gradually gotten worse as the year goes along. Stone Smart, Will Dissly. This is terrible.
They've all had their games. Yeah.
Right. And it's because of Justin Herbert that they are where they are. This is a tough one for me to handicap. I think a lot of people are going to be on the Chargers. Everybody's still got the memories of this Houston regular season fresh in the mind. The Texans, by the way, this is the 8th consecutive time that they've played the Saturday afternoon game. Literally every single time in franchise history that they've made the postseason, they have played the Saturday afternoon game. So good to keep that streak alive. This was the obvious one to put there. It's not like there's even another game that would make sense. I lean LA here. I think they're the better coach team. I think they have the better quarterback. They're healthier right now. But at the same time, like personnel wise, I don't think there's a much of a gap here. Even when you factor in the injuries for Houston, like there's still probably more marquee players on that Houston roster than there are for the Chargers.
Yeah. And the other factor is the Chargers offensive line is a real problem. They have two good tackles, one of which didn't play yesterday. Joe Alt switched sides to cover for that. Then their Pipkins, who started at right tackle, got hurt in that game. Their interior offensive line isn't very good. There was a sequence against the Raiders where they had first and goal at the one after a PI. Ran in the middle, stop. Ran up the middle, stop. Run up the middle, stop. Settle for the 18-yard field goal.
No push. No push on any of those.
So bad. The thing I was perplexed is, well, let's try something different. Maybe don't run up the middle. At least maybe do a quarterback sneak or something. Although maybe you don't want Herbert to get banged up, but it was really kind of baffling sequence there. And this is at a point where the game was not settled either. They broke it out later, but still, it was one of those games I'm like, ugh. And yes, I was using Herbert in DFS too, so I was biased in that. I did the Herbert McConkey combo there. Should have done Herbert Johnson.
Well, I started Trey Lance in DFS. That didn't go great.
Oh, thrill seeker.
He had so many opportunities to throw touchdowns and was either throwing way short or way long on every single one of those. I thought I was being so sneaky. He was like 4,200. No, Josh Dobbs actually ended up being the low cost quarterback to go with.
Yeah. Yeah. Who among us thought that Trey Lance? I don't know. There's got to be a joke in there somewhere, but I like, the Christmas Day game against Baltimore still just seared into my memory for Houston, which is why I really have a hard time getting behind them. I want to intellectually take Houston here. Like it should be the play. Yeah. And I can't bring myself to do it. I don't know.
I think the under might be the
days
play.
To decide. Say that again.
I think the under 42.5 might be the play for me here. I don't really trust either of these offenses. I think the Chargers, they've shown capabilities of being explosive when they have to. Like when they, like you think back to that Bengals game, the Ravens game earlier in the season. They could put up points when they absolutely need to, but this is still a pretty good Texans defense. It's been a solid run defense, one of the best, if not the best, pass defense in the NFL. So I don't see a ton of points here. I think this is one where the Chargers probably bleed them out. I think I could see this being like a 21-17 type of game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I think I'm on board with that. I think both teams have good field goal kickers. That helps. Although
big time.
Yeah. So I'll say like it's going to be some sort of weird, like 22-19 sort of game where there's a ton of field goals kicked in this one. But that's we're kind of on the same path there, definitely. Mm-hmm. Pittsburgh, Baltimore. Okay, so Pittsburgh looks so bad lately that all of a sudden now they are a 10-point favorite in this one. If you want to just go back just a couple weeks ago, week 16, when we had that Saturday game, it was a 6-point game at Baltimore. So that's how much that Pittsburgh's fallen in people's eye.
Yeah, and I think it's more about Pittsburgh than it is Baltimore. I mean, obviously the Ravens are rolling right now. They put up 35, 31, 34, 35 in their last 4 games. But maybe you give the Ravens a slight upgrade, but I think it's a multi-point downgrade for the Steelers, who could not be coming in colder. Right, lost 4 in a row straight up. They've scored, they've scored under 17 points in 4 straight. They failed to hit 200 yards of total offense the other night against Cincinnati. Which no offense, my goodness, I mean, doing that against Cincinnati is ridiculous. George Pickens is a mess. Russ is starting to look more like Denver Broncos. Russell Wilson, the running game has really slowed down. Like it's almost impossible to find an edge for Pittsburgh here. It's like everything points me toward Baltimore. I will say the Zay Flowers injury could be big. And I think he's 50-50 at best, I would think, to play in this game. It sounds like he's dodged anything major. That certainly looked like it could have been much worse on Saturday afternoon. But if he's not out there, this is not a team that has much wide receiver depth at all. They do have tight end depth. Maybe we see maybe we see some Charlie Kohler, but there's a good chance you're going into this game with Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, and Tylan Wallace as your top 3 receivers. So that could be a little bit worrisome. But at the same time, when Baltimore dedicates itself to the run, which it did in that second game against Pittsburgh, you just see so few mistakes from this Ravens team, and the defense is significantly improved. I mean, they've been top 5 in EPA defensively since week 10. And they were in the bottom 10 for most of the first half of the year. So they figured something out in the secondary. And I also just don't feel like Pittsburgh could even exploit that. Even if you're still worried about the Baltimore secondary, we've known all season that like George Pickens is their only option for throwing downfield. And it just feels like he's totally checked out. If he's not giving you somewhere between 2 and 4 circus catches down the sideline. Like, what else do you have? You'll hit the one Freiermuth, maybe you'll get the one Calvin Austin play, but that's about it. Like, I don't see Pittsburgh keeping up here at all. Can they hold the Ravens under 30 points is the question. Historically, this rivalry has been played almost exclusively in the 30s, occasionally in the low 40s like that. I think they combined for 51 in the last meeting. Like, that has been the anomaly.
Yeah, I got a lot to say about Pittsburgh here real quick. First of all, about George Pickens. I gave out George Pickens on VSiN at 64.5. I was aggressively wrong. I want to apologize for that. I'll do so on VSiN as well on Wednesday night. Oh my goodness. What is wrong with him? I mean, you had various teammates talking to him, trying to get him focused, getting him online. He was like taunting his own fan base, or, it's just, what are you doing? Russell Wilson was terrible in this game also. Pickens was wide open in that the second to last play of the game, overthrew him, or, maybe Pickens didn't run the right line. I was reading, we had the guy from Steelers Live on our show earlier. I was reading his column about that, about the 2-minute drill, and he wasn't quite sure whose fault that really was on that miss, but it was a bad miss. But all throughout the game, there was one good throw. He threw that beautiful dime to Mike Williams that kind of saved Pittsburgh early on when they got nothing going on. But the 2-minute drill in the end of the first half was just as bad as the 2-minute drill at the end of the game. Russell Wilson had a QB sneak on 3rd and 1 where no one lined up in the A gap. All you do is go through it, and he goes, this weird go down early thing, gets touchdown. Of course, the refs immediately signaled first down because it was so open and because they're so prone to giving Pittsburgh whatever they wanted. Sorry, that's a little bit of saltiness there, but there's 3 straight plays where they signaled first down and had to be corrected. It was crazy. First, Freiermuth on the catch, then on the QB sneak, and then on the 4th down play where they move the chains, first down. Nope, ref assist comes down and said, no, he didn't come close to making it. They didn't even measure. It was so bad. I mean, they didn't even bring out the sticks and say, okay, you need to redo this. No, they just said, you guys totally missed this play. It was wild. But the point is, though, like, where was Justin Fields on these 2 plays? Where was something that worked so great early in the season? They didn't even think about doing. It was just baffling to me that Wilson was terrible on this. Pickens was out of it. Freiermuth was the only thing that was working. And of course, he had that unlucky drop at the end of the game. And that would have gone for a good amount of yardage, but I don't know if they would have got the kickoff in time. When he dropped it, there was like 11, 12 seconds left, and he was still upright, obviously. He's going to run for a few yards.
Right.
If he goes down right where he catches it, it's too far. It's like a 65-yard field goal attempt. He had to run about 10 more yards or find a way to get out of bounds. I don't think he does both. No. I think he does one or the other, if that. And I don't think they get the kickoff in time. So,
the whole game came down to what was ultimately a really tight window throw and what would have been a very difficult catch by Freiermuth. I think the Pickens overthrow, I put that more on Wilson than I do Pickens on 3rd down. That was their chance. That's the type of play that Cincinnati has given up so many times this season. And it's like Russ played this horrible game, and you're thinking, all right, if you could just complete this throw, maybe all that's erased. You'd feel good about Boswell hitting that field goal and you get out of there. But yeah, it was brutal, man. Like, this is who Russ has been for the most part for the last few weeks. I think that mid-season ascent of Russell Wilson, like that's gone. He's not playing with confidence. The decision-making's been terrible on that final drive. Just took a terrible sack, that ran like 25 seconds.
Well, and the running play before that, he scrambles, gains 3 yards, gets tackled in bounds. I mean, they don't call the timeout then.
Didn't even make an attempt to get out of bounds. Like, turned it upfield into a defender. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if he gets out of bounds. It would have been close, but you got to do everything you can to get out of bounds there. Unbelievable. Like, that's the thing. It's like we could talk about missed throws, but the decision making, the confidence for Russell Wilson looks completely different than it did a month and a half ago.
Yeah, and as the weather got colder and the opponents got tougher, he shriveled up. He was horrible against the Chiefs as well. Just horrible in that one too. So it's hard to feel confident about the Steelers, and yet I feel like, again, I'm trying to guard against recency bias, but yet I can't see a path.
Yeah, I could see them keeping this close for a half, because were the Ravens trailing against Houston at the half last year and then really put it on them in the second?
They just destroyed them in the second half.
Like I could see something like that where, Baltimore, especially if they don't have Flowers, they're a little tight. Lamar's had some of these games where he comes out and just looks a little shaky early on. Like I'm not saying this is going to be like 40-7 Baltimore, but I don't trust the Steelers to keep up. I think the Ravens just have too much firepower offensively. And, even if they only get to 24 to 27 points, I mean, it's been a month plus since Pittsburgh has shown that they could score anything close to that.
Yeah. And they're not going to do Bengal things to try to keep them in the game, like the punt play, for instance, there. That was just insane. It was so Bengals to be able to do that there. And the Bengals offense went into a shell once they lost T. Higgins. They didn't have Chase Brown. They lost an offensive lineman, which was already threadbare to begin with there. And yet TJ Watt didn't have this massive game either, though. It was all the interior pass rush in this one there too.
You held the Bengals to 19 points at your place. It's like that's the goal, right? I mean, I think if you're the Steelers and you said that's the result you're going to get defensively, you would feel great about winning this game. And I think to not even be able to get to 20 points necessary to win this game just says a lot. So
it does.
There are a few teams that are limping in. You don't feel great about Green Bay. You don't feel great about Houston. Pittsburgh's on that list. A team that has just built zero momentum over the last month.
Yeah. Only game we haven't talked about yet is Denver Buffalo. Let's do that before we get out of here. Denver's had a great season. I think it ends here pretty emphatically. But I mean, credit to the Broncos. Other teams have opened a door for, not play their stars and teams haven't walked through. Denver burst through that. Bo Nix had an incredible game, barely missed. I mean, yes, the Chiefs were starting me and you and a couple other, Steve Bono at quarterback, I feel like. But, nonetheless, they took care of business. They took care of it emphatically.
The Chiefs had 98 yards of total offense. They had 5 first downs in the entire game. Like, this was one of the bigger beatdowns I've ever seen. The Chiefs, I was on the Chiefs to cover 11 here. I thought they would put out some sort of effort, but we saw nobody, right? And you can only have so many inactives, but none of their regulars basically touched the field at all. We didn't even see Kareem Hunt. We didn't see any Isaiah Pacheco. We saw none of really the regular receivers outside of Juju Smith-Schuster and Justin Watson, who played, partial snaps in this game. No DeAndre Hopkins, who had a $500,000 bonus if he caught a touchdown in this game.
You have to be in the red zone for it to matter.
Well, he didn't even play. Like, I thought they would make an effort maybe to get him that, but I don't know if it was the Chiefs trying to keep the Bengals out or it was just a full on, we're resting as many guys as we can. I think it was more so the latter. So if you're Denver, I mean, this went about as well as it possibly could have. You didn't have to sweat this at any point, but you did lose your previous two to the Bengals and the Chargers. You got really lucky in that Colts game when Jonathan Taylor dropped the ball. You played that weird game against the Browns before that, where you put up 41, which is great, but you gave up a bunch of explosive plays. I think this is where it comes to an end for Denver. Really fun season. Never thought the Broncos would be in the playoffs. Obviously you feel way better about Bo Nix now than you did coming into the year. It's been a great coaching job by Sean Payton. The defense has played really well. They're just overmatched on the road at Buffalo. I mean, this is where I would worry about the rookie quarterback making his first playoff start. Like, worst case scenario, you're doing it in like 27-degree weather at Buffalo. It's not going to go well. It's not going to go well.
I think it's just like the Baltimore Denver game earlier this year, where Baltimore took care of business. Now, that one, there was some weird stuff happening, some fourth down failures for Denver in that game that made it worse than it was. But at the same time, Baltimore moved the ball readily against them, and I think Buffalo will move the ball readily against Denver. No matter, their defense is really good, but it's the perfect matchup. Denver is really good pass rushing team, but Buffalo is legendary in protecting Allen too. So their advantage there is negated, I think.
Yeah, I think the Steelers, infrastructure wise, you got a lot of veterans, you got a great coach. Like, they're the team that I like I said, I could see them keeping it close for a half, and maybe Denver could do that as well. But it would take Buffalo making mistakes. I think it would take Buffalo coming into this game like what we talked about with Tampa Bay, right? Thinking like, oh, we're just going to roll all over him. We'll take some chances early on, and maybe Josh Allen throws a bad interception or there's a sack fumble or something like that. Like, those are, you're probably going to need like 2 of those type of breaks if you're Denver to hang around in this game. And in some ways, I think the Broncos are playing with house money. Like, there are a few teams like that, like Washington too. It's like, if Washington loses to Tampa Bay, we're not going to turn around and say, oh, what a failure this season was. It's like, you've already topped expectations by a ton.
100%.
And I think Denver defensively, feels like they can hang with Buffalo, but offensively is where they're going to have issues. Like, they're not going to be able to run the ball. If this turns into obvious passing situations, Bo Nix has to throw the ball 38 times. I don't think that's the recipe necessarily for Denver. So I think Buffalo, the way things broke here, I think both Buffalo and Pittsburgh are in great spots, and we're going to see a meeting between those two teams in 2 weekends.
I think your stat head project is to research the playoff history of teams that overachieved their win total by 5+ wins or so. Because we got 3 of those teams. We got the Commanders, we got the Broncos, and we got the Vikings this year. And no one's talking about the Vikings in the same way we're talking about the Commanders and the Broncos in the happy to be here moment, which is interesting because they don't have a rookie quarterback starting for them.
Right. Well, and I was thinking about that earlier today. I was at the gym. I'm on the treadmill, and I'm like, how do we want to frame this? I'm like, which teams have the most at stake? Like who has the most pressure to win this year? I think Baltimore's number one. I think Buffalo is in that category. But the interesting thing is, like, I don't think there's a team that feels like it's their last chance. Like San Francisco kind of had that feeling the last couple of years of just knowing the age and the contracts and the Purdy thing. And, now it feels like they missed their window. But I feel like for the most part in both conferences, like all these teams feel like they'll be here to stay. And in the case of Denver and Washington, you probably look at them as just getting only better going forward. It's like, Buffalo's not going anywhere. Kansas City's not going anywhere. Baltimore's not going anywhere. Even Houston should still have the edge in their division. The Chargers should be better. But the Vikings are a really interesting case because it should feel like this is all house money to them, right? You come into the year with like a 5.5, 6.5 win total. Nobody ever thought Sam Darnold would have this kind of season. You had a chance at the 1 seed. And yet I still feel like if they lose to LA, it'll be really disappointing, in a way that would be different from Washington or even Tampa Bay or Green Bay or any of these other teams losing early on. Like, I think Minnesota has been so dominant and Sam Darnold has been so good that expectations are now maybe higher than they should be based on where we came into the year.
Right. Oh, it's funny is like Buffalo had that feel a little bit last year. They did their reboot this year. We kind of talked about at the beginning of the season how we got some negative vibes about Buffalo. How they had
I
to
was
do
down
the
on
reset.
Buffalo. I was very wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they did so well with their reset. I mean, the Diggs trade, obviously he got hurt, so we don't know how. And I think that's playing a bigger story in the Houston offensive malaise than we're probably giving it credit to. But they bounced back just fine without him. Early on though, remember they got smashed by Houston in Houston, and that offense looked lost in that game. Horrible game for Josh Allen. You're like, oh, is the window really closing? Because the week before they got smoked by Baltimore too. Right. I think we have to, when we're like, oh gosh, this team is really, really struggling. Now all of a sudden, look where they are.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, and that's what kind of hangs in the back of my mind with Buffalo is the Houston game. The Ravens game where they just got blown off the field. Those were back-to-back games. Yeah. And then, of course, the Rams game where, you let up 44 points to that Rams offense. But then, of course, you go beat Detroit in Detroit the week after. It's like they're the team that has like an equal number of great wins and also questionable losses. And I still think there's a chance that Buffalo, could come up short. It probably happens, that round 2 game, Buffalo-Baltimore, somebody has to lose, right? And right. I almost wish both those teams could find their way to the AFC title game. But of course, Kansas City getting the 1, that's the reason you get it. That's going to be the game of the playoffs, I think, because there's a pretty strong case to be made that those are maybe the 2 best teams, given all the injuries for Detroit. Those are the teams that I think have looked the most impressive this season.
I agree. And that Rams game, I think you can explain away a little bit. It was a sandwich game. It was between the Chiefs and the Lions. And the offense was still on fire in that game too. Right. It was just, every once in a while, Stafford dials one up and you're just like, sit back and enjoy. Yeah. And then he turns around and does like 3 straight bad games after that. I don't know, but that's the beauty of the Rams. So yeah, I think that's where we're going to, that's anything else you want to add before we sign out here? Do you want to talk Tyreek Hill or you just want to move on?
Well, I want to highlight a comment here from our guy, Uncle Ted, who always has good commentary in the chat. He says the Texans are about to make a Super Bowl run. Maybe it's possible. Obviously they got to beat the Chargers first as home dogs. And in all likelihood, if they were to win that game, you're heading to Arrowhead in the divisional round. So we'll see. I don't like the path necessarily for the Houston Texans. But we can mention the Tyreek thing quickly. It's about as clear as it gets for a player saying they want out. Yeah. Literally pieced out. He has changed his Twitter profile to the famous Antonio Brown shirtless photo with his own head superimposed on top of Antonio Brown's, which is, I think, fitting in a lot of ways. Now, it's very difficult to trade Tyreek Hill. He has a huge cap number. There'd be a significant dead cap. We go through this song and dance with a bunch of players, and they sometimes end up being traded. So I don't think it's a total impetus. But I think in general, when players of that status come out and make it clear that they want out, in general, they tend to get their way. It's like, I think the team is scared in some ways of bringing back a player who clearly doesn't want to be there. And I think Tyreek Hill is one of those guys that you could question if he doesn't like the situation. Is he going to give full effort? I mean, he basically took himself out of the game this past week against the Jets. You could tell, I mean, Mike McDaniel was diplomatic about it in the post game, but wasn't happy. Teams will be interested in Tyreek Hill if he's available. I'll say that. We got a comment in the chat here that says Tyreek to the Chargers. I think that would make a ton of sense. I think they're a team that would be on the list of interested parties.
Yeah, but it's funny because Tyreek wasn't Tyreek this year either, though. It's not like he put a lot out there on tape saying, "Hey, I'm the same player." And yeah, okay, Tua was missing it half the season, which, by the way, the Tua not playing the last 2 games of the season thing also was kind of weird. And how they're talking, how, you know, after playing before that and seemingly being fine, getting through the injury, all of a sudden now, it's that. So I don't know. I mean, wide receivers drop off at a certain age. You see it all the time.
I think you could say that, especially for a guy who's as reliant on his physical traits as Tyreek is. You'd be looking at, assuming he were traded this offseason, he's under contract for 2025. There is a potential out after next season where you're still eating some dead cap, but it's, a little bit more palatable. And then he's, completely a free agent after 2026. You're really looking at a 2-year commitment. I think a team would be willing to take that chance. I don't, maybe not an organization like the Chargers. He doesn't strike me as a Jim Harbaugh guy necessarily, but there are enough needy teams out there that I think there will be interest no matter what, even if he comes with some baggage.
I will say, be prepared to be underwhelmed by what he returns. I think it'll be similar to Diggs in that respect.
Right.
Where guy coming off a disappointing season, disgruntled, wants out, later stage of a career. He only got a 4th round pick. Yeah, well, he costs a lot too. So big cap hit if you trade, a lot of reasons that he won't draw that much. So
I think the most fun scenario is he goes back to Kansas City. I don't know that the Chiefs would be interested in that. I have no idea, cap wise, if that would make any sense, but it's like if Kelsey's out after this year, maybe that frees up some money.
Yeah.
I'd have to do more digging on that. But as like from a fan perspective, I think that would be the most fun. He reunites with Mahomes, Chiefs offense is back, maybe tacks on one more ring.
Yeah, one more receiver to add to that pile. That'd be wild. All right. So much to talk about, but we covered a pretty good amount around. Thanks for everybody for tuning in all season long. We really enjoy doing this. And please smash that like. Please hit the subscribe button to get all of RotoWire's content. Even the offseason, we will be producing tons of content. We have still the betting podcast every week. We still have a DFS podcast every week. We'll have a preview every week for the playoffs as well. But this is the last recap podcast of the season. Thanks to DraftKings Pick 6 and LIV Golf for sponsoring us, and of course the BlueWire Network. Thank you guys for tuning in. Enjoy the playoffs. Take care.